everyone, and welcome to the third installment of The Good Street, Putting the Approach into Action. In a few minutes, you'll be joined by my colleagues Eveline de Jong and Martijn Schutte, who are going to walk you through applying all of the principles and ideas that we've presented in the first two sessions into the actual street and what that looks like in reality. Some housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the session, we're going to be using the YouTube chat function, so please just enter your questions there and we'll pass them on to the presenters and they'll address them at the end of the session. As always, we hope that you enjoy what is presented today and we look forward to sharing future content with you in the weeks and months to come. And thank you for being a part of Mobycon Academy.
Hello and welcome to the third webinar of the series The Good Street. We are in our new studio and I'm Eveline and we are here with Martijn. And we are mobility consultants at Mobycon here in the Netherlands. And today we are going to share with you how to put into practice what you've already learned in the first two webinars. So we've already learned that the streets are getting busier, there are more cyclists and other mopeds and that kind of things on the cycle paths, and we have to do something about that in practice. So what are we going to do today? Today we're going to learn how to seal the deal between place and flow and how to translate choices on the structural level that you've already made on the design on the street level. So this is the third webinar already. So if you haven't watched the previous two, maybe you should start with that, because otherwise it maybe can be a bit confusing. But for now we will have a short recap just to show you what the first steps are in the process. So Martijn, you can talk us through this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will take you to some of the most important principles and concepts that we discussed before. So first, what is the good street? Well, it's a vision, but it's also a methodology. So we're not just talking about the why, but also we're showing you how. And it's about integral design of public space. And integral means we're not just looking at traffic, at accessibility or traffic safety, but equally as important, we're looking at the livability of our cities. And we're not just looking at the flows, but also at the place, the sense of place that we have to design our cities. And in order to make a good design, it's necessary to do a structural examination of our cities and what we want to achieve. And only then can we make a truly integral design that will work. And in order to do that, we have to make choices. Making choices is very important. Well, another basic concept is balancing, and balancing takes place between place and flow. We all know flow, that's about traffic, that's about going places. And well, I said it, going to places, and place is where we stay, where we live, where we do all kinds of things in our cities. And in order to go to those places where we stay, we have to move. And we always have to find a balance. And you can see two extreme examples, just staying or a lot of flowing. But there will also be lots of areas in our cities where we have to strike a balance and accommodate both place and everything we want to do in there, and also the flow. And secondly, very important, in order to make a good design on a local level, it's also very important to take a close look at the network level and make sure that the choices we make on a network level will also be translated into the local level. Otherwise, if we just start designing our streets, things might go wrong. So all the time we have to keep the balance between those things you see here. Another thing we have showed and talked about a lot is this diagram about the vehicle families and vehicle types. So just a brief recap. You can see 7 rows with colors. Those are our vehicle families. We classified our vehicles firstly based on mass, and secondly based on achievable speed or operating speed. That's the speed a vehicle can achieve without tampering with it. So a car can go 200 an hour and walking maybe 5 or 10. And in each cell you see a vehicle type. So that's every vehicle included there has the same amount of mass approximately and the same operational speed. And you can see all kinds of existing vehicles, but also new vehicles will fit in those cells. And we can treat those cells, those vehicle types, well, without looking further at whatever vehicle it may be. So even if we come up with all new kinds of vehicles, we can fit them into this diagram. And why do we do this? Because we want to eliminate big differences in mass and speed. So this helps us a lot. Here's an overview of our methodology. On the left you see place, on the right you see flow. And in the end we're going to bring them together. But first, and Lennart has talked a lot about it, we start with place. Can you show the first pic on place? So what we end up with, after lots of deliberation of what we want to achieve in terms of place, at least we have to come up with some kind of zoning map, and we have to describe what functions should take place in each zone, what values do apply, what qualities do we want to achieve, and maybe a lot more. And we have to attach like a maximum speed to that that fits those qualities that we describe. And once we're finished with place, maybe in a second workshop or a second step, we take a look at the flow. And that's the traffic policy we have in place in our cities and neighborhoods. But also we have to define networks, and not just networks for the car and the bike, but we think we should make networks for every vehicle family. So that includes also a network for trucks, a network for light electric vehicles, and a network for pedestrians. Once we've done that, we bring them together. So that's the first act of balancing that takes place. And we do it at the network or structural level. And we hope we can combine what we want to achieve for space, or place and flow. If not, we have to go back. And if we can combine them, we have to make well, choices. And we set that in urban traffic environments, and we'll get to that later. And then the final step, once we set the set of conditions and qualities we want to achieve, we can go to the actual design. And that's the fourth stage in this methodology. And we might have to do, again, some balancing by taking a closer look at what's going to happen in that particular street. And finally, once we've finished our design, it's always a good idea to take a look back and see if that still fits our description of what we want to achieve on a structural level, if it still fits, if it still meets what we set on our traffic policies, the networks we define, and what we want to achieve in places. And once we do that check, well, we're done, and we can move to the next street we want to take a look at. So now today, the first part is about sealing the deal between place and flow on the structural and network level. And as I said, we're going to do that with urban traffic environments. So what is an urban traffic environment? So basically it's an area or a street, but it can be an area consisting of a lot of streets in which, well, a certain set of qualities about both place and flow do apply. And attached to it, there's also a kind of maximum speed that fits those qualities. So we always have to ask ourselves three questions. One, which spatial qualities are essential? What speed is appropriate with that? And which vehicle family, so one of those colors you saw in the diagram, is normative for the design? And it doesn't mean that other vehicle types or families are not allowed. It just means that there's one vehicle type that's normative for the design in the next stage. And maybe it's best to show this, to demonstrate this by some examples.
Yes, so I have this example of a pedestrian area, and if I look at this picture, do you have certain qualities that only apply in this context?
Yeah, so this pedestrian area or shopping area, it can be a name of an urban traffic environment. And there's some qualities attached to it. And I think most important, this is a place to stay, a place to linger, a place to do all kinds of urban activities. In a shopping street, it will be shopping, but there can be bars, people meeting each other. So even though there can be a lot of people moving through that area, it's not about flow, even for the pedestrians. It's about, staying and about accessing all the addresses in this street. And there will be lots of movements in all kinds of directions. So actually, aside from pedestrians, no vehicles fit in. So this also means that like 10 kilometers per hour is a natural maximum speed for this. And also the normative family is the pedestrian and not any other vehicle.
Okay, so no vehicles are normative here, but they can be allowed.
Maybe you can see a cyclist here also passing through this street. So either that's illegal or maybe the cyclist can be allowed, but then he has to adapt to the pedestrians because this is an area where the pedestrians are king. And those kind of conditions we set in this urban traffic environment before we start designing this actual street.
Yep. And if we look at this type of area, so this is more wide already set up, so this has other qualities. What's the difference between this and a pedestrian area?
Yeah, I think the most important difference here, this is an example from Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and I know there were some conditions set before the actual design was being made here. It's still a shopping street, but it's more mixed. There are some bars, some restaurants, people live in the street, so lots of residences, apartments, and also it's important for this street to be like a minor collector road. So in this urban traffic environment, it's not just about staying in place, but it's also to some extent about flow. And it's not a thoroughfare, it's not a distributor road, but it's a minor collector road for the area around it. So that means we have to combine those functions in the street also with this minor flow. And if you translate that, we thought that 30 kilometers an hour is a good maximum speed for this, because there will still be a lot of crossing in the street, and if cars drive by 50 or faster, it's not really nice to cross the street. It's not safe, and people won't cross the street, and it will be a traffic street. So we think 30 is enough, and also we think even though there's a certain amount of cars should not be normative here. But this is a street for like scooters, bicycles, and a lot of pedestrians. And cars can again be allowed as a guest, but they have to adapt to the urban life that's happening in the street. And again, that's a set we can take into the actual design later on. We'll get back to this.
Yep, okay. And we also have neighborhoods where there's mostly residential areas, mostly people living there, so we get something like this. Could you tell something more about this kind of street or area?
I call this a suburban residential area. Of course, there are different types of residential areas, and they may have their own urban traffic environment set of conditions and everything. But here I think it's suburban, so it's quiet, it's green, there's enough space, but it's mainly meant just for living. It's residential. And residential means also, your kids should be able to play outside in a safe way. You should be able to meet your neighbors, and it should not be too busy. So in this type of environment, we cannot still imagine large flows of vehicles. So again, the car should not be dominant here, and in terms of speed, 30 is a safe maximum. So even if the kids are playing and sometimes they run into the street, no very serious accidents will happen. So this 30 kilometer fits this kind of neighborhood.
And this is a suburban residential area. And if it's less suburban but more urban, do you think the same principles apply that you just mentioned?
I think the same principles would apply. So again, that would still mean like 30 kilometers an hour, for example, in a lot of residential areas. But maybe if it's busier and if there's other functions like bars or shops, then maybe in this case, there should be different conditions for the actual design. For example, more space for pedestrians.
Yep.
This is still quite a bit car or traffic dominated, and that can change in inner city urban areas.
Yep. So maybe the quietness or the green can be less and more urban.
Yeah, more pavement, maybe.
And then we have this kind of urban area. We do have those kind of urban areas, so we call this a more rural area.
Yeah, it's like areas we see around our highways, and those functions we see here, well, they're not made for people walking by or just passing by. So they are car-based. Think of strip malls, gas stations, but also manufacturing areas. They line the highways. So that means a lot of people also need to arrive there by car or maybe by truck if there's good delivery and everything. And it also means that here it's no problem that the car is dominant. And maybe in some areas even trucks can be like the dominant normative vehicle family for the actual design. And there's not a lot of crossing here, and okay, maybe we should still think of something for people to walk and cycle, but this is definitely a car area. Yeah.
So
we'll get to this later as well with the actual design stage.
We don't want to ban the car out altogether. We want to give them separate spaces where maybe there's more room or where it's more convenient or
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think all civil engineering people know this diagram, or at least some of you do. Normally we work with traffic numbers and that sort of thing, and that's something we haven't heard in the Good Street yet. Or do you think these principles should also be applied in the Good Street, or do you have your own intensities or that sort of thing?
Well, that's a good question, and in itself there's nothing wrong with this diagram, and it's like a tool that can help us with the actual design later on. But I see two problems with this one, and one, it's all about flow and about traffic conditions related to each other, so there's no place for place in this equation, and I think we should definitely should take place into the equation. And second, the other danger is if you apply this diagram straight away, well, you might be stuck too much with like the present situation and try to translate the present conditions into a future design. So maybe that's why I think it's better to really think what you want to achieve and to set those urban traffic environments before you actually start designing. And then later on you can still use this as one of the tools to make the actual decisions. But this is not the thing to start with, if you ask me.
Yeah, because otherwise maybe you would say, okay, I have this amount of area or cars in this area, so I can't do mixed traffic because there are too many cars. And maybe in the Good Street you can do it the other way around. Like, I want to have mixed traffic, and then how many cars are still allowed in there? Yeah,
so the other way around. And then the maximum amount of cars can be like a condition for the actual design. And then you have to make sure that the design that you make also helps, and you have to make sure that your network choices are in order. And that's why it's important to look at all those steps before you do the designing.
Yep.
Maybe I can tell a bit more about the design stage. So that's the final part of our methodology. And it's only then when we really start allocating vehicle families into pieces of those space in our cross-section. And I think it's best to demonstrate it by a lot of examples, but first we have to just discuss three concepts which are quite central in the Good Street methodology. And those will be domains, classification, principles, and the big question of mixing and separating. So let's start with the domain. A domain is, a physically separated part of the public space. So in normal English, you can think of maybe a road or a sidewalk or a bike path or maybe a buffer space without any traffic. And each domain has first to start with a normative vehicle family on which the design for that specific domain is based. So that can be a car or a bicycle or a pedestrian. And attached to it is also a maximum speed that will apply to that family, but also to any other vehicle that might share the space. So that applies to everyone within that specific domain. So third, we have to make sure that the design we're going to make of that domain does fit what we set by 1 and 2. So we cannot say we want a place for pedestrians and 10 kilometers an hour and design it like a highway. So it should be coherent. And ideally, we have to make sure that within each domain there's also a place to park our vehicles, bicycles, cars, because otherwise we might end up with lots of bicycles just being put in the sidewalk. So we block the traffic flow for the pedestrians, or we block what we want to achieve in terms of place, like a place to meet other people, and there might be no space if there's too many bicycles parked, for example. So we should accommodate that as well.
And how is a domain different from the urban traffic environments that we just saw?
Yeah, I think urban traffic environment is more about a general set of conditions, qualities, functions we apply to the entire street or maybe even to a larger area. And a domain is really a part of our street, part of our cross-section, also physically separated. So if you drive on the road, there's a curb. And the curb and maybe a buffer space is separating that domain from other domains. And in domain 1, different conditions may apply than in domain 2. But, of course, there's always like a normative vehicle family, a normative domain that fits what we set in the traffic environment. But there may be other domains which may be slower for other vehicles, and more strict rules will apply there. And maybe it's best to show it by the second concept in this on a local level. That's a classification principle, and that's well, an existing, or maybe we can make some custom principles as well. It's a division of a street, of a section, into 1, 2, 3, or maybe 4 domains put together, and we show some examples later. And maybe the third one, and that's a very important one. So once we set which domains do we want to apply in a certain space, we have to meet the questions about mixing and separating. So do we mix the vehicles or do we separate them into many domains? Well, we have 6 vehicle families. I don't think in any space we want 6 domains apart from each other for every vehicle family, so we do have to mix. And rule of thumb is we can mix, and maybe we should mix if it's possible or safe. And when is it possible and safe? If the differences in mass and velocity are limited. So if yes, let's mix, and if it's not safe, we should separate. And we develop some general rules, but maybe it's best to show some examples and go through it and show how we actually deal with this question in practice. And before we do that, we just take a look at 5 of those vehicle types. We also saw in the diagram earlier on pedestrians, bicycles, and cars. We all know them. But it's also nice to take a look at some upcoming vehicle types. We see more, also especially last year. That's the speed pedelec. So it's an e-bike, but a very fast one. So it can achieve speeds of 40 or up. And there's like an e-cargo bike, which you increasingly see in our inner cities, replacing big trucks for deliveries or other transport activities. So let's take a look at these 5 vehicles and see how they fit into certain traffic environments.
Okay, so this is the Suburban Residential Street. I think we just saw it as an urban traffic environment, sorry. It's quite wide. I see a lot of space for cars. So what would you classify this domain as?
Yeah, so let's bring in the first domain. I think, well, it looks like a road, it looks like it's designed for cars, and unless stated otherwise, well, 50 kilometers an hour might be the actual maximum speed limit. In some areas it's 30, but there's still a lot of areas where it's still 50. So we could say this is a 50D domain, 50 for the maximum speed. D is for the car as a normative family for which this domain has been designed. It's wide, it's tarmac, and it's really inviting to really go fast. So in practice, this is like a 50D.
Yeah. But if we look at it this way?
Yeah, so now the big question is, what can we put in the 50D domain? And we have this nice diagram here, and we can apply it to other domains as well. And I think most important is you see the vehicle diagram with the families, the types, and then superimposed we see two lines. The blue line is for the D, the normative family, and the red line is for the maximum speed that is set here. So, and where they cross in the upper left corner is like the ideal vehicle type that the domain as well perfectly fits. And in this case, D50, there's not really a lot of vehicles that fit into this category. Large neighborhood electric vehicle, for example. And we see the picture of the car here, but the car can go a lot faster, so we call it D50 plus. So in our 5 vehicles we try to examine, there is none that really fits this D50 nicely. The other dark gray areas upper left from this ideal type D50, it's also no problem to just separate those vehicles. But again, in our set of example, there's no vehicles that fit in. And we see the car here. The car is D, the car is on top of the blue line. So it's very much welcome in this domain, but we see it's on the right side of the red line, and that means the car is welcome, but the car should reduce its speed to 50, which is quite logical for a maximum speed. Yep. But again, it can safely be mixed into this domain. So the car, we can put it in 50D, no problem. But let's bring in the other vehicles. We might see some problems there. You see all those other 4 vehicle types end up in the red zone, and well, you can imagine what the red zone means. It means it's not allowed to mix them in this domain. Why not? Because if we move one step like further down in terms of family, so we are D, C, it's okay, but B or A, it's just too, the differences in mass are just too big, so it's not safe to mix them. And the same, if we go left more than one step, then the differences in speed will be too much. And again, mixing those is not safe. And especially if both the mass and speed are differing too much. For example, with the pedestrian, you end up in the red zone. But even the bicycles and even the cargo bike, they're either too light or too slow to be safely mixed in this 50D domain. So we have a problem here. Maybe we can see what happens if you push the button. They're not allowed. So just the car in this case. So maybe let's move on to the next domain. Well, we have some buffer domains, as you can see, and then there's another one. It's quite small here. It's in normal English a sidewalk, and in the Good Street terminology, it's a 10A, meaning it's made for pedestrians as normative family, and well, 10 kilometers an hour is the maximum speed that applies here. So here you see the difference. The entire traffic environment was set as a residential street for cars, but in domains we have this road for the car and we have the sidewalk for the pedestrians. Now let's see what happens if we mix in our vehicles. Well, you can see on top of the blue line, left of the red line, is the pedestrian. It's the 10A domain is made just for this group of participants. So they perfectly fit. No surprise, a sidewalk for pedestrians. What about the bike and the cargo bike? Well, we have a problem here, or at least a slight problem. They're not in a red zone, but they're below the blue line. And that means, well, actually they are too heavy to be mixed safely, especially the cargo bike. And if you are below the blue line, we say, well, if there's no specific domain, no other domain where you fit more properly, you might be mixed in, so it's allowed, but conditions may apply, maybe only at certain times, or some other conditions may apply. And one important condition that always apply, well, if you are a guest in this domain for the pedestrian, even if you are allowed, you're not allowed to go any faster than 10 kilometers an hour, because otherwise, if that heavy e-cargo bike is just going on that small sidewalk and the kids walking there, we have problems. So you are allowed, but you have to drive very slow. So this is not ideal both for the pedestrian and not for the bikes as well.
No, and especially not in the tiny amount of space.
In this case, no.
In this case, that is the 10A domain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you want to cross the street by bicycle, you have no other choice than to use the sidewalk if you want to do it safely. But this is not a thing I would propose.
No. Oh. we immediately go to the alternative. Because I will go back just a bit to this slide. So now we have the 50D, so that's for cars. We have the 10A, that is for pedestrians. And the cyclist can be allowed in 10A, but there is hardly any space.
Yeah. But if you have to make a choice, better on the sidewalk than on the streets, if you leave it this way. But of course, we can change some conditions.
Yep. So if we change some conditions, what can we do?
Yeah, maybe so. Let's bring another example of another street that's been designed in a different way. Well, it's a residential street.
Yep.
It's green, it's suburban. This is in a Dutch setting, but the street looks different. So let's bring in the domains. It's pavement, it's not asphalt, and I think when we discussed the urban traffic environment, we said, well, 30 is a proper speed for this place, and it should not be car dominated. So that means in the Good Street methodology, if it's 30, most of the times it's advisable to make like the light electric vehicles, the middle class vehicles, including the cargo bike. They are like the normative design family here. So it's a 30C. And cars can still be allowed. But let's take a look at the diagram and see what happens. So again, we see the blue line, we see the red line, and on top left is the C30 vehicle type, and which is in our example the e-cargo bike. So this road, this pavement road domain is perfectly fit for the e-cargo bike. And let's take a look at the rest. Well, a bicycle, it's in the same dark gray area. It's only one class slower and one class lighter, so it can be perfectly mixed. So it's also a proper space for the bicycle.
And I can see a 30 sign here. Does it mean that they have to go 30, or the maximum speed is 30, or how?
The maximum speed is 30. So for a sporty biker, it's no problem if you drive 30. And we expect, that's the thing in the classes, that at least you drive 10. So 10 to 30 kilometers an hour can be mixed in this domain without a problem. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it's not you have to cycle 30, otherwise you have to be somewhere else, but the maximum speed is 30. Okay.
Yeah, correct. And then the speed pedelec. So if you really try hard, I think you can drive 45 kilometers an hour. But it's a bicycle, it's a bike, it's the B family. So we say you are allowed here, but you have to limit yourself to 30 kilometers an hour. Because if you mix, if you go full speed, 45 or maybe 50 if you're real good, and you mix it with like small kids who might just go this in the street, and if they crash, then the difference in speed will be too big. So it's okay to mix like a little kid who maybe goes 10 or 15 an hour and mix a speed pedelec, but no one drives any faster than 30.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So they would have to apply themselves to the rules of 30 kilometers per hour.
Yeah.
Also in the design, I think maybe then you can do something to realize that. Yeah.
Yeah, agree. And now we just have to take a look at where the car will go. So the car is just below the blue line, and that means below the blue line, if there would be another specific domain for the car, then move there. But in our case, there is none, and I don't think there should be any in a residential street like this. So we can allow the car as a guest, and of course we have to, because you have to reach your home when you have to. But again, you have to keep to the maximum speed of 30 kilometers an hour. And also by the actual design, you have to make sure that the driver feels that I'm a guest. It's not my street. It's not made for me. It's made for other vehicles, and I'm allowed as a guest. So I should adjust my behavior in a proper way.
Yep. And now you can do that by doing the pavement or having speed bumps or that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the design should actually speak for itself.
Yeah.
And it's not always possible, but if you drive it, you should feel like, well, 30 is enough.
Yeah. Well, I think also the main difference between the first example that we saw, that it was quite wide, and this one, which was quite narrow, maybe that's also a sign for
Yeah,
cars.
definitely. Yeah, that will help a lot.
Okay, then we go back to the diagram. We see the pedestrians that are in the red zone.
Still in the red zone, so
Still in the red zone.
it's not like a big shared space still,
No.
because the pedestrian is too slow and too light.
Yep.
But we have a sidewalk for that, so that's no problem.
Yeah.
And it comes up right now. So again, lots of space for other activities, for parking, for grass maybe. And on the right side, there's the sidewalk, and the pedestrian can just walk there and play there.
Yeah, because it's also quite wide in
Yeah.
this case.
Yeah, because if all is well, we set in our conditions in the urban traffic environment, this is a residential area, it's suburban, and it's not just for walking, but also for playing.
Yep.
So we should make some space for that as well.
Nice. Then we go. Yeah, so the pedestrians have their own space.
Yeah, and the rest is not allowed
The rest
because they
not
have their
allowed.
own space.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So we have the distributor road. We already saw it as a space where there's less activity. So the 50D may be a good place here.
Yeah, it's quite appropriate here. We don't need to say a lot about this, I think. It's made for the car. And there's still activities, car-based, but still there's just, so I don't think any faster than 50 would be wise or advisable.
Yeah.
50 is a proper speed, and yes, there's a lot of space for the car, and there's still some place for people to walk.
Yeah. And
But
the
cycling?
cyclists. Yeah.
Well, I don't think so. I think we have a problem with the cyclist. Because basically the 50D 10A configuration, even though if it's wider, it's still not safe to put the bicycles in this 50D domain based on the diagram we have.
Yeah.
Maybe we can take a look at it.
Yeah, so now we have the cyclists actually in the 50D on not a separate domain.
Yeah, it's not in this picture, but that could be a solution
Yep.
to make a bicycle lane. To paint it maybe red or a white line and have a bicycle lane. But still it's in the 50D, and if you really apply the good street principles, it's actually a no-go, because it's not physically separated from the car.
Yeah. So I think you have then two options. One is to see if you can fit in another domain, and the other maybe is that maybe there are no bicycles on this street, and maybe the next street over, because you have a great network, has space for the cyclists.
Yeah, agree. So if you cannot fit it into the street, but then you have to think on the network level, where do we create a good infrastructure for bicycles, so there's no need to have bicycles in this highway, for example.
Yeah. But what if we do want to fit it in? I think we have an alternative. to this?
Yeah, so I think there is an alternative for a distributor road that can fit bicycles very well, and I think in Holland it's a very common one. So let's take a look at a typical Dutch example of distributor road in an urban setting. Bring it on.
Yeah.
So it's not as wide as the more highway type road we saw, but it could also apply to like a 2x2 road. But yeah, let's take a look at the domains. So there's still the 50D for the car, there's still the 10A for the pedestrians, but the bicycle path, and it's separated from the road by some buffer space, so it's physically separated. And it's a third domain, the 20B. So now let's take a look what happens if we try to assign our vehicles. Well, the car, of course, still goes in the 50D without any problem, and the rest didn't fit, still applies. The 20B, well, we don't have to put the car there, and top left of our diagram, the blue and red line, is the B20 family, so that's the bicycle, a bike path, no surprise, I guess. Speed pedelec, well, it's a B, so yeah, it can be accommodated in the bicycle path, but again, 20 kilometers an hour as a speed limit, so you have this nice, expensive bicycle, and you have to drive slow, but at least there's a place to drive safely. And for the e-cargo bike, below the blue line, so ideally there would still be like another domain, but there isn't in this case. So it can be allowed as a guest, but then if I'm the driver on the e-cargo bike, I have to adapt to those cyclists because it's a bike path, in this case a 20B, so made for the bicyclist, 20 kilometers an hour. And a pedestrian. Well, it could be mixed, but we have a separate domain for that. So in this case, we don't put the pedestrian on the bike path.
Oh, we immediately go to the shopping street, but in this case, it is possible to have a separate domain for the cyclists, while in, well, approximately the same space as the distributor road that had no cycle lanes, but it does mean that you have to give up one lane per direction. So that's also something to think about, I think. So
yeah, but the good thing is you have to also think about it on the network level. And you have to make sure that, well, it's still wide enough for the amount of cars it needs to accommodate, or you have to make another choice for another road that will be promoted to a highway or distributor road, so you can change the infrastructure on the existing one.
Yeah, so it doesn't all depend on the design of one street, you really have to.
Yes, that's why I think that's the nice thing about the methodology. It also looks at from the policy level to the street level, and you can make choices either on the structural level or in the design. Yeah.
Okay, so we have the shopping street. We already saw it once, so yeah, 30C.
Yeah, again,
it's also quite narrow.
Quite narrow pavement. The car is allowed, but it's not really actually designed for cars. And a big sidewalk for walking and other urban activities. Yep.
We do see the cycle racks, or at least a place to park your bike, are on the pedestrian path. Or
well,
the
if you take a close look, it's not really so. It's well, yeah. So it's the same kind of pavement, but then in the division of space, there has been allowed for. So in some parts there is like a bicycle parking. There's benches in other parts. There's trees. So it's like an intermediate zone.
Yep.
With different functions, and always there's like 3 or 4, maybe more meter space for the pedestrians.
Okay, yeah.
So you should not put your bike aside from the rack in front of the shop.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that's the Netherlands. So we have this downtown area in New Orleans, but you can see the same in, I think, all kind of cities in the US, Seattle, but also all around the world. But I do see a lot of asphalt here.
Yeah, so I think
is it a 30?
it's not the through road, and I don't think this is like a 50 kilometers an hour setting. But even if it's 30, it's still a car. It's designed for the car. So I would classify this as a 30D. So maybe in terms of speed, not that much of a problem, but in terms of space and in terms of atmosphere, well, you can see the sidewalks are very narrow. And maybe you want to have more space to really accommodate those functions better. So we can make some changes, I think, and make it look like the street we saw before. So for example, what we can do is make the sidewalks bigger and just make the street, of course, smaller. And we can make the street into a different design, so the 30D will be of a different type, and maybe make it into a 30C. And maybe also change the asphalt into pavement to also make it look like a 30 street.
Yeah.
And the good thing is, by doing that, we also create extra space for the pedestrians.
Yeah, but it does mean changing something in the network. Or at least in this case, you narrowed it down this much that it's actually a one-way street.
Yeah, and we say the car is not normative anymore. Yep. And I think that automatically means in our methodology, if you say C is normative family, then it can never be a main route for cars. And well, probably it's possible here because it didn't really look like a main route. But in case if there isn't really any other alternative, then you cannot do this. But you have to make sure it fits your choices on the network level. But if you can do it, make the D road somewhere else and have a 30C in this street in order to create more space for urban activities.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think this is the last example. So we now have the overall design, the overview.
Yeah, and I think we went through all the steps. And I think one last advice would be if you finish this street design, then it's always good to make the check just like we did and take a look back at does it still meet what we set in the urban traffic environment. All the conditions, all the qualities, all the speed, does it still apply with this design we made? If not, we have to make some changes. And I think also it's good to check if it still fits the networks we define and if it still fits the policy, our spatial policies, in what we want to achieve in certain areas. And so always do the checkup. Yep. That will be my advice. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're now having a short break. And after the break, we will do some questions and answers for you. So, welcome back. We now have a couple of questions that were asked in the chat. So, the first one is, what steps can North American cities take to enable more mixed-use streets and to be able to execute them properly? So, quite a
Yeah, it's a big question,
yeah.
And if we know the answer, then we'd be lucky. Well, there's a lot of things we can do and maybe should do. So it's not just a matter of changing every street, getting the cars out. Probably that won't work. Maybe a huge traffic jam. So we have to start by looking at the policy level and defining our networks in a way to make sure that maybe in some parts of our cities we do either exclude cars or maybe make them second place below active transportation or other vehicle modes. And once we did that, we can also actually go to that design stage and apply proper design so, well, that it fits. It should be coherent.
Yeah.
So we should work in a coherent way, and that would be my advice. Start with the policy level and go through all the steps.
Yeah, so start on a structural level, make sure that everything or cars can go somewhere, but there's also room for cyclists and pedestrians, and then you can then design it to, if there are still cars, to slow them down and to mix them properly. So that's...
Yeah, or you can make another choice and say in this street or this area we make a car free.
Yep.
But then you have to think about either accommodating the cars elsewhere Or maybe changing your policy and say, well, we don't want you to reach this area by car.
Yep.
But it involves choices at any of those levels.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can almost do an entire webinar about just this question. But so for now, I think we will go to the next one. So it's traffic calming. It's one of the solutions to slow down the cars. So put in speed cushions. Is that the first thing that you think of when looking at it in the Good Street way of thinking?
Well, you can never control behavior fully, but I think if you have to put in like speed cushions or anything like that, then maybe there's something wrong with the design, or maybe the other choices you made in the network level or in your policy. So if there's too many cars, you have to think of other solutions at the network level. And second, if you don't want cars to drive too fast, I think firstly I would try to find other solutions in the design level. So not making it a wide street, not using the asphalt, but using pavement. And if that still doesn't work, you can think of more other solutions if that's necessary. But maybe if it's a good design plus good network choices and facilities elsewhere, then you might not have that problem anymore. So maybe no more need for speed bumps, anything like that.
Yeah, so in the case that we solve New Orleans, the shopping street, if you just put in speed bumps, maybe there would be less cars. Yeah, we can see it here. If we put in speed bumps, maybe less cars, but it would still be a car-dominated area.
Yeah, maybe we can succeed by getting the cars out, but if we want to have bicycles instead, and if you just drive it on a bike and you do like this every time, then then you have a solution that's not really a good solution for cyclists.
No.
Or maybe those e-cargo bikes for delivery instead of the big trucks.
Yeah.
So you have to think of that as well, not just looking at the cars, but looking at all the vehicle families and types.
Yep. Okay. Then next question. Oh, that's a long one. Every bus rider is a pedestrian, but the bus is a 50E. What considerations should we have for integrating these modes, bus and walking? Should we have these streets with only buses, bikes and pedestrians? So no cars, I think.
So like a specific bus lane maybe. Well, there are examples in cities where there's dedicated infrastructure for buses. So that can be like a 50E domain. For example, on routes where there's lots and lots of buses and it's not safe to mix it with e-cargo bikes or lower, or maybe cars not desirable. So you can do that. And in a lot of other conditions where there's like a bus every 15 minutes or 30 minutes, you can still mix in the bus, but then the bus will be guessed. But of course, if there's lots of areas where we decrease the speed from 50 to 30, there will be an issue in public transport that we slow down buses. But that would be a policy level choice. What do we prefer, fast buses everywhere or safe streets that fit other activities as well? And then again, we have to think of other solutions. Either accept that buses will go slower in some areas, or we have to make sure that in other streets we accommodate those buses and make these dedicated bus lanes.
Yeah, because if we just have a 50E domain, then cars can also go 50.
They can be mixed.
If they...
But not like the motorcycle, not the scooter, not the C family, because then the differences will be too big. It's not safe.
Maybe a tram or something like that could be mixed more easily with pedestrians, or not mixed, but in that type of environment.
But then the tram would also have to adjust. And there's examples of trams going 10 kilometers an hour through a pedestrian street. So that's the concept of being a guest. It's not a right, like if it's a pedestrian street, there's not always a right to drive a car or a right to drive a tram or bus. So it can be allowed, but under conditions. And you have to think well about those conditions. And if there's other possibilities, other opportunities, then better not to mix them, of course.
Okay. Well, I think that's... Oh, we have still one question. Yes. I recall during the last Good Street webinar that your team was working to integrate your methodology into Dutch policy. Any progress, lessons learned so far?
Well, in some parts of our methodology are getting more commonplace, and that leads in many places to like decreasing the maximum speed and maybe changing streets and make those 50D domains more like a 30C domain. So examples are coming up, but we're still struggling with those vehicle families and vehicle types because at present rules and laws are a bit different. So it's not just possible to just execute this one-on-one. But still you can use the way of thinking. So even if your laws and rules are a bit different, you can still use the way of thinking and try to make it work with the current laws and rules so that it works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
But
I think there's also more focus in general in Dutch policy and that sort of thing on the activity side of things or the...
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes you hear people say, but what about the bus? What if we slow down the traffic? What happens to the bus and the bus system? But then you can say, well, we thought about it in the Good Street. So I think there's getting more opportunities we see in our work where we can come up with the Good Street and say, okay, but the problem is here, you start making a design for a street while you do have to think about some network issues first before you can make this design work.
Yep.
Yeah, but we're still looking for more cases to apply it to, definitely.
Yep.
But I see a lot of opportunities for that.
Great. Well, that was our last question and answer. So we will go back to... Yes. So we have had our third episode. So now we've talked through you with examples, but now we want to hear something from you. So if you are a paid member, please send us pictures and a brief description of a situation, and we can prepare a Good Street meaning workshop with you, so you can really walk through the entire process instead of just us talking through one example. Just how can you change a street to really fit in the activity side of things, the place and the flow. So, and if you're willing to also present your case live, that would also be nice. So you can contact us in the information below, and then we can maybe set it up to have a fourth episode. And if you still want to keep learning about the Good Street, because it was quite a lot of information already, but we still have a lot more. We have a downloadable PDF available in the Mobycon Academy downloads, and you can also find it on the Mobycon website, which you can find here on the slide as well. So you can just walk through it by yourself in a nice format in PDF. And for coming up next in the Mobycon Academy, because it was our first one in the new year, but we have quite a lot coming more. So we have the Together We Cycle filmmaker Q&A that's coming up. We have some study tours, virtual study tours of Delft, Houten and Amsterdam. We have the winter cycling, learning more about the what and the why about winter cycling, especially in the colder countries, and a lot more. So subscribe as a friend of Mobycon Academy, just €10 a month at the address below. And for now, we want to thank you for your time, and we hope you learned quite a lot. And yeah, have a good night.
Yeah, thanks a lot for watching.